You're listening to international investment advisor Doug Goldstein on the Goldstein on Gelt show, the financial show where we'll talk about how you can make the most of your money. With all the confusing financial chatter bombarding you each and every day, Goldstein on Gelt will give you the practical information you want and need about living a financially stable life. Here's your host, money maven Doug Goldstein.
Okay, we are back. We are talking to Harry Lorayne. Harry Lorayne is perhaps the world's foremost, I wouldn't say perhaps, is the world's foremost memory training specialist. To demonstrate his memory, Harry Lorayne would sometimes stand beside the entranceway to a hall, and 1,000 people, 1,500 people would walk in, and he would casually meet with them. And then during the show, he would promise to pay someone perhaps $1,000 if he couldn't remember their name. And he always remembered every single person's name in the audience. He is known for memorizing phone books. He's written books about memory. In fact, that's how I originally met him. His book, called The Memory Book, was on the top of the New York Times bestseller list for about a year. I would say Harry Lorayne is, as he was referred to by Time magazine, is properly known as the Yoda of memory training. Actors like Alan Alda wouldn't do a script without applying his memory systems. And New York City's Mayor Mike Bloomberg uses the systems, as well as Police Commissioner Raymond Kelly. Even Colin Powell, when he was the Secretary of State, when he met Harry Lorayne, he said, "You helped to make me general." So Harry Lorayne has been just about on every TV show in the U.S. and abroad 23 times with Johnny Carson, and I have to say that I have been blessed for having read his books and learned and used all of his methods, and I am honored, Harry Lorayne, to have you on the show with us today.
Well, thank you. What a nice introduction. I hope I can live up to that.
I'm sure it wouldn't be a problem. I have to tell you, I first learned about you when I was in yeshiva in Israel. I walked into a friend's room and I saw you wrote a book a little while ago called Page a Minute Memory, which
yes.
I read, and as a result of reading it, I began memorizing decks of cards. Of course, I was the top student then in yeshiva because I could remember everything that happened. When I went back to university, learning pretty much everything was made so much easier. So I have to thank you for getting me through the last 20-plus years.
Well, it's my pleasure, sir. I'm glad to have been of help. You know, it's interesting that you mentioned that about schoolwork, because one of the things I wrote a book way back in 1973 called Good Memory, Good Student, and then I wrote another one, Successful. In other words, one was from up to high school, the next one was past high school to graduate school. And what happened years later, we condensed the two books and put them into one volume called Super Memory, Super Student, because the publisher wanted that. But the reason I'm telling you that is that they arranged for me to interview teachers and students, if I wanted to, with one of the top high schools here in the New York City area. And what's interesting is even with my first one, way back in 1973, I had a lot of problem with educators because they all kept saying, "Oh, memory is not important." Because in one of my books, I had said there is no learning without memory. Well, that started a whole furor. It started people debating, and I got to tell you, Doug, I never lost that debate because there is no learning without memory.
So, and let me ask you a question on that. How come teachers, right, I fully agree. I've never understood why people send their kids to school where they don't actually learn stuff, because if you don't have any knowledge, you can't do any analysis. How come the education people can't pick that up?
Well, you know, that's a good question. I probably could write a book about that. I tried to get it into the American educational system when I first became known and started, and there was just too much red tape. I just forgot about it. It didn't make sense for me to bother with it. But the truth of the matter is there are people all over the world who teach their students my memory systems, even though it's not part of the educational system. And my books I used as textbooks in a lot of private schools, you see. So the truth of the matter, you know, I've written this, so forgive me for quoting myself, but I always said that the word learn and the word know, K-N-O-W, and the word remember, they're all synonyms. If you know something, you've learned it. If you've learned it, you've remembered it. If you remembered it, you know it, don't you see? So I have to repeat, and it's interesting that you brought that up, that there is no learning. When I was doing research for my last book that I mentioned before, I was talking to teachers here in this high school, and they kept saying, oh, no, we don't use memory. We use doing and concepts. And I kept saying, I know what those words mean. I know what the word doing means in context, but what does that have to do with what we're talking about? Mm-hmm. And they just kept saying we don't use memory. And I'll make this very quick. I'm standing in a lady's room, the teacher, and on the blackboard is the periodic table, when you're teaching chemistry, right, et cetera. Right. And I said to her, I'm a pretty good actor when I want to be. And I pretended to be kind of naive and said, gee, I've been out of school for a long time. Do you still teach this periodic table? She said, of course we do. I said, well, again, I've been out of school for a long time. Do you still test your students? She said, well, of course, we have to grade them by test. I said, well, again, a very naive and silly question. I only know of two ways of testing when I went to school, and that was either multiple choice or fill in a blank. Right. Do you still use those concepts? She said, yes, that's the way we test. And she had been saying to me for 15 minutes, we do not use memory. We mm-hmm. use doing and concepts. So I finally said to her, well, I have one final question. What if a student, when they were taking this test, and the question was, the symbol for iron, I-R-O-N, the symbol for iron is, and there was a blank. What if the student put in R-L? Mm-hmm. And she said, well, he would get a wrong mark. He would get a bad grade. I said, well, let me ask you again a very naive question. What mental calisthenic did that student have to use in order to put in the correct symbol for iron? It took me 3 minutes to get that lady to admit it would have to be memory. He would have to have remembered the symbol. You see, it took me 10 minutes. So to answer your question, why is it not used in our education system? I don't know.
I hear that's a good question. So let's fast forward a little bit. I'm in the business world. I'm only on the radio once a week. The rest of my day is taken as an investment advisor. I run a company called Profile Investments in the center of Jerusalem, and I certainly use the techniques in my business all the time. But you've now mentioned how students use it to improve, but maybe talk a little bit about why people in the business world would want to or absolutely need to improve their memory.
Well, it's the same old story. Look, if anybody wants to buy an insurance policy and they ask a simple question, if that salesman, the insurance salesman, has to say, oh, wait a minute, let's see, and he takes out a big, thick catalog and takes 15 minutes to find the answer to your question, that's the usual way. Mm-hmm. But if you're talking to somebody who answers your question immediately because he remembered it, you are so impressed that you buy his policy. Mm-hmm. That's one difference. Well, I do a lot of corporate seminars. That's what I do basically now. Quite honestly, they're the only ones that could afford me, Doug, at my stage of the game. And when I say to them, tell me the two important things you want your people to learn how to remember, because it's according to the time they allot. In other words, sometimes I'll do a 2-hour seminar or a 4-hour or up to an 8-hour. So I want to know, what is it you want your people to learn?
Wait, let me guess. The first thing they have to remember is to remember people.
There you go. The two things. The first thing is names and faces. Mm. In other words, to answer your question, if you call Paul Sam, you're not going to sell him anything. Mm-hmm. I mean, you want to remember your potential clients' names and your current clients' names. You want to also, and the second thing is numbers. So those are the two things that are usually mentioned to me: names and faces, and numbers of any kind, style numbers, stock prices, things like that are so important. So when you say business, one of my books it's out of print now, so I'm not trying to sell anybody anything. It's called Memory Makes Money, and it was geared. Yeah, it was geared toward the business person. And there were interviews in that book for people like the head of the American Stock Exchange at that time, and Ralph Destino, who was at that time the CEO of Cartier's, the jewelry company, and people like that. And you mentioned Alan Alda before. Well, Mel Brooks is interviewed there because he and Bancroft may she rest in peace, always applied my systems to their work. So there are interviews in that book from mainly business people and how important it is in business. So, yeah, I mean, there's no question that it's... You know what it is? I have found, and I guess I'm very fortunate that way, Doug, that my memory systems are important to young people, students, and business people, midlife people. And one of my current books is called Ageless Memory, which is geared towards older people.
Oh, well,
so it takes...
I was going to say that I think that's one of your books which I don't have. I thought I bought all of them already.
No, that's kind of current. It's
okay,
called My original title for that was the Over 50 Memory Book. They're the same systems, Doug. They really are. So I got to be honest with you, except that I geared them as I geared the systems toward business people in the other book I just mentioned. These are the same systems, but they're geared toward older people. They'll learn how to remember anything, but also that I remember to take my pill today. You know.
I'll tell you one thing interesting about that. After I first started on this 20-something years ago, I got very excited, and I got all my friends involved. In fact, I must have bought 10 or 15 copies of Page-a-Minute Memory just to give out as presents to people who I wanted to help out. And then I figured, okay, this guy Harry Lorayne has a good idea. Let me go see what the other memory experts have. So I started buying every book and every subject and every expert in the field. And can I tell you something? Not a single person had a new idea from... It looked as though they had all read your books and just rewritten them somehow.
I have started an industry. My first book was in 1956, Doug, way back, and my God, I was 4 years old, okay? It was in 1956, and that book sold like 20 million copies, because in those days a book was $2.95. And there were full-page ads all over the world in 18 different languages about that book. Since then, I have had, I'll use a nice word, probably 300 imitators. The not-so-nice word is rip-offs. So, that's the way it is. I started an industry.
But I've often found this. I feel that people who, I think around the time I'd also read Dale Carnegie's book, and I thought, wow, he really had some great new ideas. And then I started reading other more modern books about it, and there was simply nothing new under the sun. And I think that for people who want to learn memory, you got to go back to the core, the guy who started.
You go to the boss.
Yeah. So how did you get started? How did you start as a memory specialist?
Oh boy. All right. Somebody once said to me on television, just before we were coming to a commercial, and I had done my thing, I remembered the names of everybody in the audience, and et cetera, et cetera. And just before we went into a commercial, the host, a man, said to me, Harry, and he asked the same question you just asked, Doug. He said, how did you become the world's foremost memory training specialist? And I said, stomach cramps. And he turned pale under his makeup. He thought I had gone nuts, when I said stomach cramps. So we went to a commercial. And I said, don't get excited. It's just a cliffhanger. I'm going to explain what I just said. Okay, I will explain stomach cramps. When I was very young, Doug, I'm talking about 10 and a half, 11 years old, okay? I had stomach cramps every morning. Except after a while, it started to dawn on me that it was only Mondays through Fridays, not on weekends, not Saturday and Sunday. In other words, it was school days. And then I realized why. I had a teacher, I never forgot this, and I'll never forget her. I can still visualize it. It was a teacher. Her name was Mrs. Goldfisher, and she used to give us a test every day, a little yellow rectangular piece of paper, which we numbered from 1 to 10, and she would ask 10 questions, of things we had read or she had talked about in the classroom. But the problem was that she would grade them every day, and then we had to take it home to have at least one parent sign it, to prove that we showed it to our parents. Well, I failed every day. I was getting marks like 40s and 50s, whereas my little classmates were getting, 70s, 80s, passing grades. I was getting failing grades, and I had to take it home, and my father, who died when I was 12 years old, so you can see how far back I'm going, Doug. Like I told you, I was 10 and a half, 11 years old. He was the signee, and when he saw my failing grades, he used to hit me. So that's what was frightening me. I was scared of getting hit every day when I brought home that test. So the stomach cramps made me think about it. Of course, and listen, Doug, I'm dyslexic. In those days, when I went to school, there was no such word, or if there was, I never heard it. When I was a little boy, I was stamped moron because of these kind of grades I was getting. So, the cliche is, you give me the name, I'll play the game. They called me moron, then I thought I was stupid because compared to my other classmates who were getting passing grades, I was failing. Okay, I'm walking to school one day with those darn stomach cramps, and the light bulb went on in my head. I stopped, and I said, wait a minute. Why are they calling me stupid? It's not a question of stupid. The kind of questions that are asked on tests in those years when you're that young, there's no way to intellectualize them. Now, I didn't know the word intellectualize at that time, but I can say it now. There's no way, for example, a question could be, what's the capital of Maryland? Well, There's no way to intellectualize that. You either know it or you don't. But remember what I said to you before, Doug. The word know is the same as remember. So when I say you either know it or you don't, that means either you remember it or you don't. That's when that light bulb went on in my head, and I said, wait a minute. If I could only remember the things that Mrs. Goldfisher is saying in the classroom or on the pages she tells us to read, I will be able to remember the answers, therefore I'll get passing grades, therefore my father won't hit me. In other words, that was the whole thing was to stop my father from hitting me.
All right. So how did you then figure out what to do?
Okay. I ran to the public library here. I called it the Pitt Street Library. I was born on the Lower East Side. It was a ghetto. We didn't know that word either, but in those years, but that's what it was.
And what language did you speak in your house growing up?
Yiddish was my first language. So when I first started to go to school, it was difficult for me. It was embarrassing to speak English because I was accustomed to speaking Yiddish. My father and mother spoke Yiddish only. Well, when they didn't want me to understand what they were saying, they spoke Hungarian or Polish, or something like that. But the basic language was Yiddish. So anyway, I ran to the Pitt Street Library. The technical name was the Hamilton Fish Library, but it was on Pitt Street in the Lower East Side of New York. And I could still visualize the librarian because this was a pivotal point of my life. I said to her, "Oh, is there any book I could read to help me remember?" Well, she took me to a room to help me. We had to wipe away the cobwebs. Nobody had been in that room in God knows how many years. And sure enough, there were a few books in one corner based on memory training, dated back to some of them to the 1700s, the 1800s. Most of them, I have those books in my private library now. But I didn't know anything about it at that time. I spent 5 hours in that room, Doug. The librarian, this older woman, kept coming in to make sure I was all right, because I stayed in there. I was standing there going through those books. And I got to tell you that, again, let me be redundant to tell you that I was only 11 years old. So that 99.9% of the things I was reading, I didn't understand.
Sure.
But the 0.1% that I did understand changed my life. What I did, and I didn't realize I was changing things or manipulating or being seminal in any way. What I did is I took the little bit I did understand and made it work for me. It was strictly altruistic. I just wanted to, as I say, help myself so my father wouldn't hit me. So I came up with ways of remembering what's the capital of Maryland or what's the chief export of Poland or things like that, and I started to apply it to my schoolwork. And you want to know something? I started to get hundreds in those tests.
Amazing.
What's interesting? What's interesting, Doug? When I started to get hundreds, Mrs. Goldfish, and I've written about this also, because in those days it was very strange. She said to me one day as we're leaving the classroom, she said, "Harry, what happened? You're finally getting hundreds and passing grades, which I expected from you when we first started the class. How come all of a sudden?" I said, "Well, I'm starting to apply memory systems." She says, "What are you talking about?" I said, "Well, if I want to remember that the capital of Maryland is Annapolis, there's a little girl in our class named Mary, and I visualized an apple landing on her head. An apple is landing. An apple is the capital landing on Mary's head. Maryland." That told me the two things, that the capital of Maryland is Annapolis. And you know what happened? As I'm telling this to Mrs. Goldfisher, I saw the curtain drop over her eyes, and she said, "All right, Harry, sit down." She thought I was crazy. So that's what you asked me a question. I think I told you more than you wanted to hear, Doug. That's what started it.
That is great, and I'm happy that worked out for you. I'm sorry that you had a little rough time when you were 11 and a half, but it worked out. Harry Lorayne,
yes.
who is in fact the world's foremost memory training expert, I am very grateful for the time that you've spent with us today. Maybe as the last question I'd like to ask, could you please just tell people how they can learn more so they can improve their lives too?
Well, the best way, all right, very quickly, I do a lot of corporate work, and many years ago, corporations wanted me to do seminars, and I was very busy, but I could only be at one place at a time. So I had some instructors, and I sent them out, to corporations to do the seminars. And what happened, the presidents of the corporations would call me and say, Harry, so-and-so was very good, but we want you. Well, that was very ego-stroking, very nice, but I could only be at one place at a time.
Sure.
So what I did is I put together what I called a Memory Power course. There are a bunch of CDs and DVDs, etc. The point is that I personally do the teaching. And that was the closest I was able to come to personal teaching by me. And it's called the Memory Power course, and that's the thing that people like Colin Powell, some of the people you mentioned before, that's what they studied. And if people who are listening to you now, Doug, and listening to me are interested, go to my website. It's harrylorayne.com. It's very simple. Well, not that simple. You have to remember
how to spell your name. Right.
Yes, it's Lorayne. harrylorayne.com. You know what I did? A lot of people couldn't remember how to spell my name, so you can also go to fantasticmemory.com. Takes you to the same website. That everybody knows how to spell, fantasticmemory.com or harrylorayne.com. That's it.
And I am honored to say that I have now spoken with Harry Lorayne, who is, in fact, the man with a fantasticmemory.com. Harry Lorayne, thank you very, very much for joining us tonight. Anyone who's interested in more information should go to Harry Lorayne, LORAYNE.com or fantasticmemory.com. Certainly you should read his books. I have, and it has really changed my life. I've taught a lot of other people. I've taught my kids. I remember when my little girl was about 9 years old, I said, it's time you learn how to memorize a deck of cards, and she did, and took all of those skills throughout her schooling to become a very successful student as well. So anyway, Harry Lorayne, thank you very, very much for joining us today.
Oh, it's been my pleasure, Doug. Good to talk to you.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
You've been listening to the Goldstein on Gelt Show with money maven Doug Goldstein. Doug's weekly radio show is heard around the world, but if you miss it, you can download the podcast at www.goldsteinongelt.com. The Goldstein on Gelt Show gives you up-to-date financial ideas so you can get on the path to financial freedom. If you'd like your questions answered on the air or off, send Doug an email to doug@profile-financial.com. It's your money for your future, so join Doug every week to build your wealth on the Goldstein on Gelt Show.